It began quietly in the small town of Heiligenfeld, nestled between cold forests and the still rivers of southern Germany, where the air always carried the faint smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The year was 1942 and the world beyond the hills was breaking apart, but here among the crooked houses and narrow cobblestone lanes there was still an illusion of calm, as if the wind itself hesitated to bring news of what men were doing beyond the borders. In that town lived a group of women who had learned to survive in silence while their brothers and husbands vanished into distant battlefields. Their days were filled with waiting and their nights with whispers that never reached the morning. The town had no factory and no garrison, only a small church, a bakery that opened before dawn, and a forgotten garden behind an old stone house at the edge of the forest. That garden would change everything. The house belonged to an older woman named Clara Weissman, who once taught languages in the city before the war took away her students and her husband and left her with books she no longer opened. She spent her evenings tending to her roses and the few rows of vegetables that survived the frost, her hands always covered with soil. One evening, a younger woman named Anneliese knocked on her door, soaked from the rain. She carried a small leather satchel and a look that didn't belong to anyone from Heiligenfeld. Clara let her in without asking questions because she could tell the girl had nowhere else to go. That night the storm covered the sound of their voices as they spoke by the fire. Anneliese said she had escaped from a train that was supposed to take her east. She didn't say what was there, but Clara understood from the way she avoided her eyes. The girl had been working in a factory before she disappeared. She told Clara she had seen papers hidden in crates, marked with codes and destinations not meant for anyone in Germany. Those papers spoke of shipments of experimental gas and equipment bound not for war zones but for something more secret. She said she took one of the pages before running away. Clara listened, and for the first time since the war began she felt something other than sorrow. She felt purpose. The next morning Clara brought Anneliese to the garden where 3 other women worked, Marta, Greta, and Elise, all widows or sisters of men who had gone and never returned. They spent their days growing herbs and making ointments for the sick soldiers who sometimes passed through the region. The garden was a place no one cared about but everyone respected, because it was quiet and because it fed the town when food was scarce. Anneliese showed them the page she carried, yellowed and folded many times. It had a list of shipments leaving from a coastal port, written in code but with a few words that could still be read: New York, Baltimore, and a strange word beneath them, Project Morgenrot. At first, the women didn't understand what it meant or why it mattered. But Clara had studied English once, long ago, and she knew that those cities were in America. The thought that something from Germany was being sent across the ocean during wartime seemed impossible, yet the letters were clear. She believed it meant something dangerous, a plan hidden inside the chaos. That night, the women decided they could no longer just wait for the war to end. They would find out what the project was and stop it before it left their country. To everyone else in town they were still the gardeners, the quiet ones who sold herbs and bread. But beneath the garden's soil they buried more than roots. They buried messages, small pieces of parchment with copied words from the page Anneliese brought. Marta's cousin worked in a postal station 2 towns away, where she could slip letters among shipments bound for the capital. Greta's brother-in-law was a mechanic near the rail lines. Slowly, with no one noticing, the women began to weave a web of whispers across southern Germany. Every week they met under the moonlight among the rose bushes that had long since lost their color. One evening, as they sat around a single lantern, Anneliese revealed she had seen the man overseeing the project, a tall, quiet officer with a scar over his left eye who never gave his name. He spoke often about a cargo bound for America that would change the balance of everything. No one knew what it was, but the urgency in his voice had frightened her enough to run. Clara decided they must find where the shipments left from. With the war tightening around them, trains were heavily guarded, but the women had one advantage: no one ever suspected them. They began traveling under the pretense of gathering medicinal herbs for hospitals. Marta, with her broad shoulders and calm face, carried the travel papers. Elise, who had a soft voice and a gift for persuasion, distracted guards with questions about their families. Annalise and Clara followed behind, noting routes, symbols on freight cars, and destinations written in chalk. They learned that shipments marked with a red circle and the letter M always moved under heavy guard and were escorted toward the western ports. Inside those shipments were sealed metal crates said to contain chemical filters, but Clara believed they held something else. Weeks turned into months as the garden continued to bloom and the town carried on unaware that its quietest women were unraveling a secret that reached beyond the continent. They collected fragments of information, maps, and dates, which Clara copied by hand and hid beneath the roots of the oldest tree in her garden. But danger began to close in. One morning soldiers searched the town after hearing rumors of stolen papers. The women watched silently from the church steps as houses were torn apart and men were dragged out for questioning. When a soldier reached for the door to the garden, Clara calmly stepped forward and said the place was diseased with mold, that even the rats had left it. The man wrinkled his nose, muttered something, and turned away. The women didn't breathe until he was gone. That night Clara burned all the old notes, keeping only the original page and the most important details memorized. She told the others that they would have to move faster now. Annalise proposed reaching a contact in the capital who might know someone connected to the foreign embassies, a woman who once studied medicine in America. If they could get the information to her, perhaps the message could cross the ocean. They all agreed, though none of them knew if they would survive long enough to see it happen. In the following weeks, they left one by one, traveling under false papers. Clara stayed behind to maintain the illusion of normal life in Heiligenfeld. Every morning she opened the bakery, sold bread, watered her garden, and smiled at neighbors who never guessed what seeds she had truly planted. At night she waited by the window, listening to the distant rumble of trains, wondering which of them carried her friends and whether any had reached their destination. The loneliness grew heavy, but she found strength in the quiet. Then one cold morning in early March, a letter arrived with no sender's name. Inside was a drawing of a rose with 5 petals, each marked with a small red dot. Clara understood immediately, it was their sign. The message was simple, the project had been uncovered, the cargo destroyed before leaving port, but its echo had reached America through an intercepted telegram. Whatever had been planned would never happen, but the world would never know who had stopped it. Clara walked to her garden and stood beneath the tree where everything began. The soil was cold under her fingers, the roses lifeless. She whispered a prayer not for peace but for remembrance. The world would move on, wars would end and begin again, but somewhere across the ocean people would wake each morning unaware of what they had been spared by the hands of women no one ever noticed. The garden remained, a silent witness to what they had done. And though Clara would never see her friends again, she often imagined them in distant cities rebuilding what the war had broken. She liked to think that perhaps one of them reached America, carrying the story that no one believed, of how a few forgotten women had changed the course of nations with nothing but courage and soil-stained hands. In the summer of 1947 the war was over, but its shadows still lingered in corners no one looked at too closely. Across the Atlantic the city of Baltimore was waking into a new world of rebuilding and forgetting. Docks that once unloaded supplies for the war effort now smelled of salt and paint and the slow hum of peace. Among the warehouses stood a tall structure of faded red brick marked simply with the number 17. Inside, behind locked doors and dusty crates, a clerk named Samuel Hart was cataloging leftover shipments when he found a box that didn't belong. It was sealed in wax, marked with a faint red circle and the letter M. At first he thought nothing of it. The box looked old, heavy, the kind of thing forgotten during the confusion of demobilization. But when he tried to move it, he heard a rattle inside, not of metal or glass but of paper. He pried the lid open and found a stack of documents in German, most unreadable, but one sheet caught his attention because across its top margin was written in careful English letters, Morgenrot Project, cancelled, March 1943. Beneath it, a handwritten note in faded ink read simply, "The garden will remain silent." Samuel had served during the war but never overseas. He was young, curious, and the strange note unsettled him. He took the papers home, spreading them out under the yellow light of his kitchen table. The handwriting was delicate, perhaps written by a woman, and the language mixed between German and English as if someone had tried to make sure it could be understood by anyone who found it. Most of the text was technical, referring to chemical compounds and transoceanic shipments, but halfway down the page a small paragraph had been added in a different hand: "If this reaches America, tell them it was the women who stopped it, not the soldiers." That sentence refused to leave his mind. The next day he brought the papers to his supervisor, an older man named Colonel Avery who now worked for the Department of War Assets. Avery skimmed them, frowned, and said it was probably propaganda from the losing side, attempts to create confusion or pity. He told Samuel to forget about it and locked the box away with the rest of the scrap material. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that it was something real, something human buried beneath official words. He decided to make a copy of the note before returning it. Weeks passed and he began visiting the public library during his breaks, searching through wartime archives and foreign bulletins. One evening the librarian, a quiet woman named Evelyn, noticed his stack of German papers and asked if he needed help. When he told her what he'd found, she looked at the note for a long time and said softly, "This handwriting isn't a man's." She traced her finger over the line about the women and smiled faintly. "Maybe they're telling the truth." Together they began to piece fragments from news clippings and declassified shipping records. They discovered that in early 1943 several mysterious German cargo ships had been destroyed in port under unexplained circumstances. The official story called them accidents caused by faulty fuel lines, but the timing matched perfectly with the date on the note, March 1943. Evelyn believed the women mentioned were real, perhaps workers or scientists who sabotaged the shipments before they could cross the ocean. Samuel wanted to believe that too, but he couldn't understand how anyone could have known it mattered to America. One evening he found another paper inside the folded note he hadn't noticed before, a pressed rose petal, dried and brittle but still faintly red. Beneath it in pencil were 4 names written only by first name: Clara, Annalise, Marta, Elise. Evelyn looked at the petal and said, this was a message, not evidence. Someone wanted it to be found. They decided to search for any post-war refugee records that listed those names. It took months of digging through archives, but one day Evelyn found a reference in a Red Cross report, and Annalise Bauer, age 24, listed as a hospital nurse in Munich, missing since 1943. Nothing else. They sent letters to consulates, to former soldiers who had been stationed in Germany, to journalists who might have heard rumors of such women. Most ignored them, but one letter came back from a retired translator who said he once handled intercepted German communications. He remembered seeing a strange phrase in a coded message from 1943, "The roses have burned." At the time, no one knew what it meant. Samuel and Evelyn understood it now. By winter, their quiet search had become an obsession. Samuel began to dream of a garden filled with silent figures working in moonlight, their faces hidden behind scarves, their hands moving quickly through soil that glowed faintly red. He would wake with the smell of damp earth still in his mind. Evelyn, too, confessed that sometimes when she passed the flower market she caught herself looking for a certain type of rose she had never actually seen. They both knew they were chasing ghosts, but neither could stop. One night in January 1948, as snow fell over the harbor, Samuel returned to the warehouse to check if the original box was still there. He found the section sealed off, scheduled for demolition. He bribed the guard with a few dollars and slipped inside. Dust and cobwebs hung heavy in the air. The box was still in its place, but a corner had been broken open. Inside was a single envelope he hadn't seen before, sealed with a faint wax imprint of a rose. He opened it and found a letter written in German but with an English translation beneath, perhaps prepared by the writer. It said, "To the one who finds this, the world will call the war a victory of men, but it was the silence of women that saved it from itself. We are not asking for names or monuments. We ask only that someone remember the garden and what was buried there, so that silence does not become extinction. If you are reading this, then the ocean carried our whisper farther than we dreamed. KW. Samuel felt the room shrink around him. The letter was not just a message, it was a confession, a record of something deliberately hidden. He folded it carefully and walked back through the snow toward the harbor where ships lay sleeping. The world around him seemed suddenly fragile, as if history itself had left gaps wide enough for truth to fall through. In the months that followed, he and Evelyn decided to publish a small article in a local paper, not about secret projects or weapons, but about the Garden of the Silent Women, as they titled it. The story described how a group of German women might have prevented a disaster through courage and secrecy. The editor hesitated, fearing political backlash, but printed it in a small weekend section. It drew little attention at first, only a few letters from readers thanking them for reminding the world that not all Germans were enemies. But among those letters came one that changed everything. It was postmarked from Zurich and written in careful English. I knew Clara Weissman. She taught me English before the war. She was real. Inside was a photograph of an elderly woman standing in a garden beside a small tree. On the back was written, Heiligenfeld, 1946. Evelyn wept when she saw it. Samuel just stared, unable to speak. The story they had uncovered was no longer a myth. It was history hidden under the weight of time and pride. They decided to travel to Europe with their savings, determined to find the garden if it still existed. The journey took weeks. In the spring of 1949 they arrived in Germany, now divided and scarred, cities rebuilt in patches like stitched wounds. Heiligenfeld was smaller than they imagined, quiet, the kind of place untouched by the loudness of history. They asked around and an old baker led them to a small cottage at the edge of the forest. There it was, the garden, overgrown but alive, with wild roses twisting around broken fences and the air thick with the scent of earth after rain. A neighbor told them Clara had died 2 years earlier, buried under the tree she loved. No one had known much about her except that she tended the sick and never spoke of the past. Samuel knelt by the tree and brushed away some leaves, finding beneath them a small piece of metal shaped like a rose, its petals darkened by age. He held it in his palm and felt the same quiet presence he had felt when reading her letter. They spent the night in the village, and under the stars Evelyn said softly, maybe history will forget them, but not us. Samuel nodded, staring into the distance where the forest met the horizon. He imagined Clara standing there years ago, watching trains move across the valley, carrying secrets she had chosen to stop. He wondered if she ever knew how far her whisper would travel. When they returned to America, Samuel kept the metal rose on his desk until the day he died. Evelyn became a teacher, telling her students stories of courage that never made it into textbooks. And though most of the world never heard of the women of Heiligenfeld, the echo of their silence lived on quietly, in papers, in gardens, and in the hearts of those who believed that even in darkness the smallest act of defiance could change everything. It was the spring of 1983 and the city of Boston was soft with rain, the kind that blurred lights and left the streets smelling of iron and lilac. In a small university near the river, a young woman named Margaret Lewis sat in the archives room surrounded by boxes of old wartime documents. She was a history student, writing her thesis on forgotten stories of civilian resistance, and most days the work felt dry and endless, lists of shipments, coded telegrams, faded reports typed by tired hands. But that morning she found something that made her heart stop for a moment. Inside a manila folder marked War Assets Disposal 1949 there was a yellowed clipping from a Baltimore newspaper, its title barely legible, The Garden of the Silent Women. Beneath it, 2 names, Samuel Hart and Evelyn Raines. Margaret read the article twice, then 3 more times. It spoke of German women who had uncovered and sabotaged a dangerous wartime shipment, possibly saving countless lives, though no one had ever confirmed the story. It mentioned a single photograph of a woman named Clara Weissman standing in her garden after the war, and a metal rose found near her grave. Something about it felt unfinished, like a melody that ended before the last note. She wanted to know more, not for her paper but for herself. That night she visited her grandmother, who lived alone in a small house filled with books and framed letters. Her grandmother's name was Evelyn. Margaret had never connected it to the article until now. After dinner she brought out the clipping and asked, "Grandma, is this you?" The old woman's hand trembled slightly as she took the paper, her eyes softening with memories that seemed to pull her backward through time. She nodded slowly. "Yes, that was us," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Samuel and I found their story. We thought someone would care, but the world moved on." She looked at her granddaughter with a faint smile. "I didn't think anyone would ever ask me about it again." Margaret sat closer, listening as the rain tapped against the windows. Evelyn told her everything, about the warehouse in Baltimore, the hidden letter, the garden in Germany, and the rose that Samuel had kept until his last breath. Her words flowed like a river long held behind a dam. When she finished, Margaret said softly, "You told their story once. Maybe it's time to tell it again." Evelyn's eyes brightened, though she said nothing more. She simply reached into a drawer and took out a small velvet box. Inside was the metal rose, its surface dark but still holding the shape of careful hands. "Then take this," she whispered. "Let it bloom again." Margaret decided she would. She spent the next months digging through libraries, embassies, and archives across Europe. She found fragments, a Red Cross registration card, an old ledger mentioning Heiligenfeld, and finally a letter preserved in a Munich museum written by a nurse in 1943 named Anneliese Bauer. The letter had never been delivered. It spoke of a plan to stop a shipment that could bring ruin beyond their shores. The last line read, "If we fail, the earth itself will know we tried." She traveled to Germany that summer, following the same route Samuel and Evelyn had taken more than 30 years before. Heiligenfeld was still small, though new houses had risen along the hills. The garden remained, wilder now, but full of life. She met an old man who remembered Clara as the woman who once gave medicine to the sick when no one else would. He led her to the tree where Clara was buried. The trunk was twisted and ancient, its branches heavy with blossoms. Margaret knelt beside the grave and placed the metal rose into the soil, pressing it gently into the earth until it disappeared. As she stood up, the wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of rain and flowers. She closed her eyes and imagined them, Clara, Anneliese, Marta, Elise, standing there as they once had, their faces lit by the lantern's glow, their hands trembling but steady. She whispered, "You're not forgotten," and for a brief moment she thought she heard a reply in the rustle of leaves. When she returned to America, she began writing not an academic paper but a book, The Silent Garden, How 4 Women Changed the War. It was not filled with statistics or military language but with stories, letters, and quiet acts of defiance. She described how ordinary people could alter the course of history not with power but with conviction. When the book was published 2 years later, it spread slowly, then suddenly widely. People were drawn to its simplicity, its truth. Critics called it one of the most human accounts of wartime courage ever written. Schools began teaching it, museums created small exhibits about the forgotten heroines of Heiligenfeld, and journalists traced every scrap of evidence that proved the women had been real. For the first time, the world spoke their names out loud. In 1986 a memorial was built in southern Germany, a simple stone garden with no statues, only rows of roses and a plaque that read, "To those who saved without witness." Margaret stood there during the unveiling, tears streaming down her face as she watched children lay flowers at the base of the tree. A local choir sang softly, their voices blending with the breeze that moved through the garden. After the ceremony, an old woman approached her, carrying a small envelope. She said she had known someone named Elise long ago, a healer who vanished during the war. Inside the envelope was a photograph of 4 young women smiling beside a table covered with bread and herbs, the world around them still untouched by destruction. On the back, written in pencil, were the words "Für die Zukunft," for the future. Margaret took the photograph and placed it in her book's final edition, writing in its closing lines, "History may forget the names of the gentle, but the earth remembers where they stood." Her grandmother lived long enough to see the book become a symbol of hope. On her last night, Evelyn held Margaret's hand and whispered, "You gave them back their voices." Years later, when Margaret herself was old and grey, she returned to Heiligenfeld once more. The garden was now open to visitors, the roses blooming brighter than ever. Children ran between the paths while their teachers told them the story of the women who once tended those flowers in secret. Margaret walked slowly to the center, where a new tree had been planted beside Clara's, a young oak, its trunk wrapped with a ribbon of pale yellow silk. She touched the bark and smiled. A group of schoolgirls approached her, one of them asking shyly, "Did you know the women who saved us?" Margaret looked at them for a long moment and said, "No, but I've heard their voices every day of my life." The girls smiled and ran off, their laughter carrying across the field like the sound of bells. As the sun dipped behind the forest, the garden glowed in shades of gold and rose, and the air grew still. Margaret sat beneath the tree until the light faded, thinking of Clara's hands in the soil, of Anneliese running through the rain, of Marta and Elise writing words that would never be signed. She realized that the shocking act those women had done so long ago, defying silence itself, had not just saved lives but had planted something far greater, something that would keep growing as long as stories were told. She whispered, "The garden will remain silent," then added softly, "but not forgotten," and with that the last bloom of evening fell across the earth like a closing prayer. And in that quiet moment, as twilight settled over Heiligenfeld, the story of the women who once changed the fate of nations came full circle. No monuments, no banners, only a garden and the living proof that courage, once sown, never dies.